Tom, a very good evening to you. You report at Long War Journal in these last moments about a man named Harzi, who is said to be dead in a drone strike or an airstrike at Mosul. Harzi, who is he? Who does the Pentagon say he is? And what does that do to connect to the events of Benghazi in 2012? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Well, Ali Ani al-Harzi was actually the first publicly identified suspect in the September 11, 2012 terrorist attack in Benghazi. So he's the first guy who was identified as someone who was involved in the actual assault. And he was identified after he posted basically updates on social media from the fighting. So this is a guy that very quickly U.S. intelligence figured out was involved in the attack. And in fact, in April, he was designated by both the U.S. State Department and the United Nations as a terrorist, and the UN specifically said that he was both a participant and a planner of the Benghazi attack. Flash forward to June 15th, just a few days ago, and he was killed, according to the Pentagon, in a U.S. airstrike in Mosul, Iraq. Now, the reason for that is that basically he and his older brother have been longtime facilitators for al-Qaeda in Iraq and its successor organizations, the Islamic State, or ISIS, in Iraq and Syria. And so it was believed that both he and his older brother had relocated to Iraq and Syria to basically facilitate the movement of fighters from North Africa for the so-called caliphate.
Harzi and the confusion, whether it's Harzi, the perp from Benghazi or not. Harzi connects us back to this radical development over the last 3 years. ISIS is a product of 2014. But if it is Harzi or if it is Harzi's brother, either way, it takes us back to Benghazi and to Libya. Ansar al-Sharia, where we see there is a connection between Harzi and Ansar al-Sharia. Was that al-Qaeda? Was that always al-Qaeda?
It was. Ansar al-Sharia in both Libya and Tunisia were always part of al-Qaeda's North African network. And the Harzi brothers, particularly Ali Ani al-Harzi, the one who the Pentagon says was killed, was actually a member of Ansar al-Sharia Tunisia as of 2011. Now, we identified this as an al-Qaeda-affiliated group early on at Long War Journal. In fact, we're the only ones to immediately say, hey, this has got to be al-Qaeda. And the reason is that the whole organization was built by known al-Qaeda veterans, people who had worked directly with al-Qaeda's most senior levels, including senior leaders, including Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, even back to the pre-9/11 days. And they got out of jail in the wake of the Tunisian uprisings and basically quickly established Ansar al-Sharia. Now, al-Qaeda used this brand, Ansar al-Sharia, in several different places, Yemen, Libya, Tunisia, also in Egypt. And so there was a commonality that we noticed in each one of these cases where it was known al-Qaeda operatives were leading the charge behind each one of these Ansar al-Sharia branches. So this was clearly al-Qaeda's rebranding. And what happened is that basically the Islamic State, which now proclaims itself to be a caliphate in Iraq and Syria, has taken advantage of this pipeline in North Africa and has absorbed some of the members and leaders, middle managers from the Ansar al-Sharia groups in North Africa into its own sort of operations. And so that's why the Harzi brothers ended up going with the Islamic State.
However, last week, Tom, I recall, you reported of fierce fighting between ISIS, the Islamic State, making inroads, declaring a province in Libya, and al-Qaeda, including Ansar al-Sharia, aggregating with al-Qaeda at the important place of Derna, that's in Cyrenaica in Libya. So while al-Qaeda and Ansar al-Sharia slash al-Qaeda might be fighting ISIS in Libya, this man or these brothers left Ansar al-Sharia and went over to ISIS. Is that how to see this? These are competing groups, but they don't share the same command structure.
That's exactly correct. What happened is that ISIS, or the Islamic State, basically has been poaching fighters, middle managers, and a few leaders from the Ansar al-Sharia groups and others in North Africa. But Ansar al-Sharia itself, whether in Libya or Tunisia, they remain loyal to al-Qaeda. They remain part of al-Qaeda's network. And what happened in Derna is fascinating because the Islamic State, according to multiple media outlets last year, had supposedly taken over Derna in Libya last year. We said at the time that was false, and what happened is that the Islamic State moved against the al-Qaeda veterans in the city just recently and basically quickly lost the fight against their jihadist rivals, all of whom were allied with al-Qaeda. So this is a good example of the fact that al-Qaeda is not out of the game, even though the Islamic State gets all the press.
Mr. Roggio, a very good evening to you. A complex attack in Kabul today the Taliban launching suicide attacks against the parliament or against the legislature in the important district of Kunduz. The significance of this, Bill, now that the U.S. is walked away from a combat role in Afghanistan. Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Yeah, you actually had two events. What you had is the parliament in Kabul attacked by the Taliban, supposedly 7-man suicide assault team. They were stopped from entering, although they did penetrate the outer and middle security at the parliament. So you got to wonder, how did they get so far in? Because they got to the last main gate before entering the parliament. And then up in Kunduz, province you have is you had the Taliban taking control of 2 districts there. Kunduz has about 1 million people in it. It's one of the I think it's like the 5th largest city in Afghanistan. The city of Kunduz. There, it's on the border with Tajikistan, and it seemed, I'm guessing around 4 to 5 of the 7 districts in the province are now under Taliban control or heavily influenced. So the Taliban are launching a full court press up north. They're hitting in the capital, and down south in Helmand, they're again heavily contesting districts that the U.S. and Brits paid dearly to liberate districts like Musikala and Sangin and others are now falling back under the control of the Taliban.
The attack in Kabul, the one aimed at the parliament, suicide bomber on foot or in a vehicle at about 10:30 in the morning, do we know?
It was a suicide bomber in a vehicle, so the bomber was able to get, again, he hit the last gate before entering the complex. So he was on foot, and then 6 fighters attempted to follow him through. They were gunned down by Afghan security forces, but you got to wonder what's going on with security. If they were they weren't killed on the very outer edge of the security perimeter. They made it somewhat deep. So, the Taliban are continuing to show that they're committed to fighting the war, not just on the fringes or in the rural areas or just in the south or just in the north, but they're showing that they're willing and capable of fighting it in the capital and throughout the country.
Bill, Tom and I were talking beforehand. Is it your measure that the Taliban is prepared to take back the whole country, or are they going to continue the hit and run?
I think we may be a couple of years away from that, where they could take control, get back to the pre-9/11 days. The Afghan security forces and the Taliban have been going toe-to-toe, and the U.S. still does have a presence there that can mitigate problems from that the Afghan security forces are experiencing. They still have air support there. There's still advisors, and you still have special operations forces conducting raids. But that's there, and the Afghan security forces are losing ground. I think if the U.S. is going to commit to a full pullout by the end of 2016, the beginning of 2017, that you can pretty much count on a major collapse of the government, particularly in the south, the east, and from what we're seeing now, even the north is not off limits. So, I definitely think they're going in the wrong direction.
Right.
How far it goes, it's difficult to know.
Bill Roggio and Tom Joscelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We started with the report from Iraq and also the report from Afghanistan. When we come back, Mr. Joscelyn's going to take us further into the stories that we're developing, and in particular, we're going to talk in very detail about a man named Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who is or is not any longer. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor, Tom Joscelyn, and Bill Roggio of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. They keep the Long War Journal. We go now to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. That's North Africa. West of Cairo is the Maghreb. And the man's name is Mokhtar Belmokhtar, one of the great names of these last years. It rolls off. It sounds very good in English. I imagine it sounds just fine in North Africa as well, and his death sounded pretty good when it was reported several days past. But, Dom, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, he does not look dead in the photographs. Has al-Qaeda made a statement qualifying the report of his death? Good evening again.
Good evening, John, again. Well, there are now 6 statements from the jihadists, 3 of which say that he's alive, 3 of which imply that he's alive, none of which say he's dead. So I think it's probably a safe bet that he's alive at this point. As Bill likes to say, some of these guys are vampires, and Belmokhtar has been declared dead probably 10 times, and each of the 10 times he's turned out to be alive. And so he's got more than 9 lives at this point. Anyway, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which he had been long a part of until breaking away to form his own al-Qaeda group, and he's still loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has come out with its own statement saying that, in fact, he's alive. And that's a pretty strong indication, because if he were dead, they would actually honor him as a martyr as opposed to saying he's alive.
Mokhtar Belmokhtar, I recall him surfacing in the news prominently as an op back at the time of the collapse of Timbuktu when the French rushed in reinforcements into Mali. He was operating in the transnational borders in the Sahel, the shore of the desert. However, there was a spectacular raid in Algeria. Is he a bandit or is he a radical? Do we make a distinction?
I mean, he's a radical. He's an ideologue who uses cigarette smuggling and other sort of crimes to fund his operations. But he's definitely an ideologue going back to the early days, really, of al-Qaeda's affiliates in the area in North Africa. But to give you an example of how sort of deep in the network he is, after the September 11th, 2012 Benghazi attack, immediately after, talking moments after, or maybe hours, but shortly after in any event, Belmokhtar receives a call from some of the attackers who were members of Ansar al-Sharia Libya, and they call to offer him congratulations. They say congratulations on the phone on the success of the raid. This was an early indication that, in fact, this was the work of al-Qaeda terrorists and was not, of course, involved, really a response to any kind of video. And lo and behold, it turns out, and you mentioned the raid in Algeria in January 2013, so just months after the Benghazi attack, in Imanas in Algeria, Belmokhtar's men go in and they overtake this natural gas facility and lay siege to it. It turns out that almost half of the attackers in that siege were actually trained in Ansar al-Sharia Libya's camps, so it's the same group behind the Benghazi attack, prior to September 11, 2012. So this is a guy who's deeply involved with Ansar al-Sharia Libya, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, his own organization. It's really sort of this sort of network of al-Qaeda groups in North Africa.
American airstrikes claiming that he was killed, or now we see that it wasn't an accurate report. Are we tracking him? Is there evidence that they've got a drone with his name on it?
Oh, I'm sure they're tracking him and trying to kill him. Part of the problem here in terms of figuring out exactly where he is unless they're sloppy with operational security in terms of making phone calls or other sorts of communications that can be intercepted, or if we luck out and happen to have human intelligence in the area, which is a rarity, I would say, in all these battlefields of these days, it's very tough to figure out exactly where and when he's going to be. And so in this case, it looks like they thought he was going to be at this big meeting of al-Qaeda-affiliated actors in Libya. He may or may not have attended the meeting, either narrowly escaped death or decided not to attend for whatever reason. But they took a shot at this meeting, and it certainly looks like he survived.
Bill, your running feature at Long War Journal that I like, you know what I love this, is the training camps boasting by the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, Syria and Iraq, both the civil wars. You report this week in your latest update that we've got 37 new training camps. 25 are located in Syria, 12 in Iraq. Why do they set these training camps up? Are they competitive training camps? People choose between them. I don't like your water. I'm going over to that one.
These camps are set up by three primarily, or three main groups: the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and the Nusra Front, which is the Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, and then these allied jihadist groups. They're from the Caucasus or Uzbeks or Uyghurs or various countries. Small units that are often fighting in Syria, and they're usually allied with the Al-Nusra Front. These camps are set up in order to indoctrinate and train fighters, and these jihadist groups are advertising them for several reasons. It's good propaganda for them. It's good recruiting fodder. And it shows potential recruits that, hey, we're not just going to throw you out as cannon fodder onto the battlefield. We'll take you in. We'll get you some skills and train you. And then it's also for the donors as well. At these camps, they learn rudimentary skills for fighting on the battlefield. They may learn how to make IEDs. They'll be indoctrinated. They'll learn small arms and sometimes heavy weapons. You'll see them training to do assaults. And in some cases, we see like training camps for children or women. We've seen a couple of those pop up in Iraq and Syria over time. So, these camps it's an important part of the infrastructure, primarily used to wage local jihad, to fight the insurgencies in Iraq and Syria, but they have the potential to be used to train individuals for conducting attacks abroad. This is what what Al-Qaeda did with its camps when the Taliban controlled Afghanistan. It would run fighters through. They fought alongside with the Taliban, and then they took select members that had the right credentials and right skill sets, and they would train them to conduct attacks against the West.
I note in one of the camps, it seems like it got lost. It's an ISIS camp very close to Idlib province, surrounded by what I presume to be spin-offs of the al-Nusra Front. So ISIS is poking its nose right into a heavy al-Qaeda territory.
Yeah, so in some cases, different jihadist groups will have control in a pocket, and they could be surrounded by rivals or enemies. And sometimes these individual groups, while there is a dispute between the al-Nusra Front and Islamic State, sometimes in certain areas, some of these groups may either coexist peacefully or even cooperate on the battlefield. Sometimes it could be a local thing versus a global or a regional problem. So, yeah, you see anomalies like this poke up on the map. Also, or in other instances, you might have a camp that used to be, and this could be, we believe around over 20 of these camps are no longer operational. And there's a case in Eastern Syria, where the camp was run by the al-Nusra Front. Then the Islamic State wound up taking over that area, so we know that camp run by the Nusra Front no longer exists.
War fighting across a vast landscape. We've just touched on some of the stories in Long War Journal in this last week, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria and then off to the Islamic Maghreb. That is North Africa. Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Watch the war through their eyes on the site. I'm John Batchelor.